What if I told you that you can increase your Warframe's heat damage by multiple times without having to change anything about your build at all? Sounds too good to be true? Well, it is very possible by using a little trick called Heat Inherit. We've actually talked about it on stream the other day, so I thought why not make a dedicated guide here on YouTube as well, so you can all use it for yourself. Big shout out to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. Now, before we get into what Heat Inherit itself even is, we first have to understand that heat damage over time effects are very different from all the other damage over time effects in Warframe. Here's what I mean. For all other damage over time effects in Warframe, like for example electricity here, the game counts every single electricity status effect by its own timer. So, as you can also see in the background right here, each and every individual electricity proc runs out once its own timer of 6 seconds is over. This is true for all damage over time effects in Warframe, except heat. For heat, every time you inflict a new heat status effect, this not only gives it its own 6-second timer, but it also refreshes the duration of every other heat DOT tick on the enemy. This means it is theoretically possible to stack infinite amounts of heat procs on one and the same enemy. Now, why is this so important? See, the thing is, because a new heat status effect refreshes every subsequent effect, that leads to a very funky situation where subsequent heat procs inherit certain properties from the first heat proc that was applied to an enemy. And these effects are your faction damage bonus, your heat damage bonus, and your status duration that you have modded on the weapon that deals the first heat status effect. Just to quickly show you what I mean, if I throw a fireball with my Ember, then the damage over time effect from that heat proc will last exactly 6 seconds like any other DOT in the game. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. However, my secondary weapon, the Atomos, is modded for plus 90% status duration, meaning a status effect from the Atomos will last for 11 seconds. Now, when I go to the enemy and the first heat effect that I inflict is with the Atomos, then this heat effect will have an 11-second duration. But when I then throw a fireball, as you can also see right here, then the status duration of that fireball will also be 11 seconds and not anymore 6 as it was before, because the fireball inherits the status duration from the heat proc that the Atomos dealt. And this, of course, not only goes for the status duration, but as I previously mentioned, also for the faction damage bonus and the heat damage bonus that you have modded onto the weapon that deals the first status effect. And yes, the only thing that matters is what you have modded onto the weapon, so the base stats of the weapon don't matter. You could theoretically do this with any weapon in the game. But how about we do a little bit of a damage comparison next, because I'm pretty sure that's why you clicked on this video, and believe me, Heat Inherit can do absolute wonders for every type of heat damage in the game. See, my Ember right here, and yes, I didn't use the Cyandana for all of you guys, so you can thank me by leaving a like maybe on the video, wink wink. My Ember right here is completely unmodded. And for the sake of damage testing, I chose enemies that don't have any damage reduction or armor, so that our results, our numbers, aren't skewed by that. And if I throw a fireball at the enemy, then the enemy will take 226 heat damage over time, which is, of course, not a lot because the ability is unmodded, and due to the fact that fireball is an ability and not an exalted weapon, it can't be modded. So there is no official way to get stuff like faction damage onto this ability. However, if I hit the enemy with my Atomos that has faction damage and heat damage and status duration modded onto it, and then I throw a fireball, you will see that all of a sudden we're doing 1100 heat damage over time. This is roundabout 5 times the damage, simply because the game now thinks that the heat damage over time from our fireball has all those properties that are on the Atomos on it as well. So we effectively tricked the game into believing that all of this right here is actually modded onto our first ability, even though that's of course not the case. But I get it, right? Even though we quintupled our damage on Ember, 1200 heat DOT ticks is still nothing impressive, and you want to see the true potential that Heat Inherit has, so let me show you my little Protea experiment here. First of all, this right here is the Protea build that I'm using. This is also one of the builds that I showed in my Protea video from last year, I think it was, and it is very strong and deals tons of damage with your second skill, the Blaze Artillery. However, we're going to be testing it against Juggernauts. And if you've ever encountered a Juggernaut in Warframe, then you know these bad boys take incredible amounts of damage. Juggernauts are some of the most tanky enemies in the entire game. Don't believe me? These here are Steel Path Bombards, and just look at how strong the Blaze Artillery is against them even without Heat Inherit. See that? Now, if we group the enemies up like this and then fire our Blaze Artillery into them, you will see that it deals pretty decent damage because it is an incredibly strong skill, but it will still struggle to actually take them out. As you can also see right here, it is not really great. However, if we use Heat Inherit, and for this, in this example, I will use the Ignis Wraith with this build right here, has a lot of heat damage modded onto it, even has a little ribbon for more multi-shot fire rate and a double status duration, then you will see a drastic difference. First off, we heat prime the enemies with the Ignis Wraith, and then shoot the Blaze Artillery. And as you can see, it absolutely demolishes the enemies. Again, these are Steel Path level 180 Juggernauts. This is not your standard heavy gunner or bombard, this is one of the tankiest enemies in the game. And by the way, the effects of Heat Inherit don't only benefit heat procs stemming from Warframe abilities, you can also do this with weapons. To make a better example, I have a Nataruk right here, which is modded into heat damage and in a way to make sure that on a fully charged attack, we're always going to have a 100% critical chance, so we're consistent there. Going back to our previous example, if we shoot a fully charged shot at the enemy, then the heat damage over time effect that this deals is 6200. However, if we prime the enemy with the Atomos first, and then we shoot the Nataruk on them, then all of a sudden we get around about 8000 heat damage over time. This is very impressive, and it shows that Heat Inherit not only works from weapon to Warframe ability, but also from weapon to weapon, which would effectively allow you to not mod any faction damage onto your main weapon as long as you can benefit from Heat Inherit. But now that you've seen what Heat Inherit is and how exactly you can make it work for yourself, you might be wondering, what is the very best and most optimal way to practically use Heat Inherit? Well, as I previously said, it doesn't matter really which weapon you use to inflict the first heat proc, because the only thing that matters is what is modded on the weapon and not the stats of the weapon itself. However, in general, pistols are the best weapon class to do this with, because pistols, as the only weapon type in the game, has access to a primed version of heated charge, therefore pistols can have a higher heat damage bonus than other weapon types, and that makes them a little bit better for Heat Inherit, although it is not that noticeable. If you ask me, I personally would prefer a weapon that has a bit of an AoE, like for example the Atomos right here, which shoots arcing beams, because it allows you to hit multiple enemies at the same time, makes it a lot easier. But also something like for example the Epitaph modded into Heat would work if you personally prefer something with a bit more of an AoE. However, before we end this video, there is one more very important chapter, and you should know this. While yes, the benefits of Heat Inherit are very obvious if you do it right, it can also, unfortunately, screw you over if you do it the wrong way. See, as we said, the game only looks at the heat properties of the first ever heat damage status effect inflicted on the enemy. So if we inflict that with a good weapon that has the right mods on it, yes, we're gonna deal a lot more damage through Heat Inherit. But if we, for example, inflict the first status effect with a Warframe ability that doesn't have anything modded on it, and then we shoot our weapon at the enemy, then all of a sudden the heat damage over time ticks are abysmally small. Just to show you what I mean here again, a fully charged shot with a Nataruk is gonna deal a heat damage over time value of 6200. However, if I first blast them with my Fire Blast from Ember, which as an ability does not have any of these bonuses, and then I shoot my Nataruk at the enemy, then all of a sudden, this cuts my damage over time into 1/3 by only inflicting 2,000 per heat DOT. So yeah, long story short, when going for heat damage in Warframe, be careful which source inflicts the first heat proc, because that determines your heat damage over time strength. And don't worry, for all you worried Jade mains out there, I have good news for you. Yes, Ophanim Eyes does deal heat damage over time, however it doesn't inflict any heat procs, meaning it does not reduce your heat damage over time value. As you can also see right here, it's still at 6,000, otherwise Jade would be a very problematic Warframe. And if you haven't already, then definitely also check out my recent Gara guide right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycan Shepherd, Undercanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Ben Spence, Leo Murasaki, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.